repairing the macro world. And we've been speaking about each of those words in the phrase in a very different sort of sense. First of all, olam, not as macro world, but olam as the self. And rather than thinking of the project that we are engaged in as repairing the world, we are thinking of it as making ourselves stable. And we've been looking through Breshit to see how Breshit presents that work of Tikkun Olam, of making the self stable. What is at stake according to Breshit? What are the challenges? What are the balances that we all in our personal lives and then on the level of collective humanity are constantly working out in order to achieve that stability? And I just want to remind everyone of some of the main points that we spoke about last week, and then we'll jump right back into the material. Last week we spent a lot of time talking about Genesis 1, Breshit Aleph, which is your first source if you're looking at the sheet now. And we began by asking ourselves what those psukim teach us about, number one, the nature of humanity, number two, our presumed relationship with God, or perhaps the aspiring relationship with God, and number three, what Genesis 1 teaches us about our relationship with other people, or what we would call the ethical plane. We found ourselves, toch kedei, the analysis, talking also about a fourth, which was the relationship between people and the natural world. And where Genesis 1 is teaching us about, again, what the opportunities are, what the threats, what the issues are. And Malka, I think, had said that we saw at the end of our discussion that really mankind is set up for a whole lot of conflict, which is sort of right there in the psukim when you look at them a little bit beneath the surface. We pulled out what we learned about at least the job of human beings. Number one, to spread out, to have babies, to fill the earth. Number two, to take some sort of control. But number three, that control has limits, and we spoke a bit about the limitation on not eating animals, and we asked ourselves, well, what kind of control or leadership or responsibility do we have towards animals when we have this leveling right from the start, that we have the same diet as animals? We also spoke about the relationship between people, and as it presents itself in Genesis 1, there is a fundamental equality. Remember the pasuk that we spent time talking about was Zachar Nekeva and Tselem Elokim. There's also a kind of natural community, male and female. The two are created all at the same time. Suddenly they're both there, and there's a sense that people really need each other for the tasks that they're set up for. Of course, most fundamentally, the task of bringing more people in the world, but perhaps even for the job of building together. And then I think it was Sima who had said, but there's almost an awkwardness or an awareness that they don't really know how to work together in community from the fact that they're given the specific charge, pruervu, get to this task. They don't, right? We assume it's a natural kind of movement. And then after we noticed that for all that detail and all of those issues that are addressed in Genesis 1, there's really a whole lot that's left unexplained. And human beings are given these very lofty tasks. We learn about human beings that they're created in the image of God. I forgot to mention that, which we'll come back to today. And yet, the direction of how to realize or actualize any of those tasks, and even more fundamentally for the second part of our class, how to balance those different tasks, much is really left in the imagination from Genesis 1. So that balance I want to return to. We spoke through the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, this is source 2, as well as in the Rabbi Simcha Bunim quote, which is source 3. We talked about the balance between achieving a stance of humility and achieving a stance of, we don't quite want to say arrogance or self-importance, but an ability to promote oneself in the world and to feel as if life was worth living. And we spoke about both of those, right, those goals as needing to be in balance in order to realize what the Mishnah talked about, which is the fullness of self. And the reality that the Mishnah makes present for any potential witnesses, that each human being, going back to our opening statement, is an olam. Each human being is a full world. And so when we relate to each other, right, from the perspective of the other, to appreciate that fullness of the other person in front of us, the full worldness of that person. And then, of course, when we relate to ourselves, to recognize that we too have that capacity to be a whole world. All right, does that feel like an accurate summary? So what came up for me before we move on to the next piece, over the course of the week, I've been listening to the seniors in this building who, for the last 6 weeks, have been doing some kind of research project, and then they present to the faculty. It's a really wonderful way of ending their education here. And one of my students did a project in conjunction with the school. We have a garden, an urban garden, both here and the academy, where kids are learning about environmentalism. They're actually learning how to do the farming. And one of my students gave a wonderful presentation about her own kind of transformation into a person that cares about the environment. She wasn't such a person before, and the doing is what has really helped her see the values. And at the end of her presentation, she brought a source, which I said, oh, that needs to be in this class. So I should tell her that I'm teaching it because of her. So this is a source in Kohelet Rabbah, which I think in many ways speaks to Malka's critiques or comments last time, and I think maybe pushes us even a little bit further. Okay, so let's first see what the text says, and then we'll investigate it further. I just want to start with reading in the Hebrew, and then we'll move to the English. This is a midrash on the book of Kohelet, which is, of course, one of the Megillot that is not studied very often. It's quite difficult. It's somewhat depressing, right? It's a realist kind of book, looking at the fullness of life, and sometimes comes on the side of the futility of life. And although the book itself is not often studied, certainly in our curriculum, there are many midrashim that are predicated on psukim and Kohelet because they're just so juicy and they're ripe for interpretation. This is a pasuk from Kohelet, Perek Zayin, chapter 7. And I'm reading just the pasuk in the Hebrew. Re'eh et ma'aseh ha'elokim, ki mi yuchal letaken et asher ivto. See God's work, for who can straighten out what he made crooked? Okay, what do you make of that pasuk on its own? It's really, we're taking it way out of context. We have no idea what else is in the chapter. What do you think it's saying? The voice in Kohelet is often a voice of wisdom, speaking both to himself as the author and really to all of humanity, a kind of invitation for philosophical exploration. Yeah, what do you think, Wendy?
Well, the Ivta is a little bit of an indeterminate pronoun reference. I mean, it's either the me, like who is the person who can fix or cannot fix what he has made crooked, or
Okay.
But it could also be what God made crooked.
Oh, okay. So what Wendy's pointing out, which is what really surprised me actually when I was looking at the translation, is that, yeah, I capitalized the H and the he to tell you that it actually almost all readers translate it that way. The crookedness is being done by God. And that's kind of surprising. Well, it's really surprising when you know the Midrash. But why do you disagree, Sima? Do you think it's not surprising? What's the sense of the verse?
To me, it's actually sort of depressing. I mean, the world is not perfect, and so the positive part about it is that God made everything. Whether it be a three-legged dog or whatever. I mean, everything is from God. But what I find disturbing is that who can straighten out, because I don't know. I just keep thinking of modern medicine and doctors or whatever have received the gift of healing and changing, and this sometimes doesn't seem to allow for that.
Oh, interesting. Okay, good. Yeah, good. Jen, you want to add to that?
It just strikes me that there's an intentionality here, that imperfection is purposeful. So you could see it as negative, but you could also see it as promising. So when you look at the for who can straighten out, out of context, there is the invitation that humanity is the one that can come in and straighten out, and that's the purpose of the
So it's almost the inverse of what Sima's saying. The kimi yuchal, who could possibly do it? Well, you know who could. That's really interesting.
I think it's a matter of judgment. There are things that we can't change there are things we should change and we should work to do so, but there are things that are beyond our control. We have to recognize that and not waste that time to try to straighten out something that is beyond us.
Nice. Okay, would actually, all of the comments, in a sense, pick up on the relationship between human beings and God in furthering the work, right? If we go back to Genesis 1, we might have expected, if this pasuk would have perfectly mirrored what we said last week, we would have expected that human beings acting out this job of being in the image of God with God's powers or God's abilities or potential, you would have thought that it would be, I mean, exactly as Jen said it, like saying it clearly, you are the ones, right? God did God's job of creating, and now you are the ones who, you wouldn't say fixing God's mistakes, that feels theologically problematic, but human beings are invited into the continuation of the work of creation. But, yeah.
Kohelet, the tone of Kohelet is not optimistic.
No.
Right, so when he's remarking that it's pointless because there's something rigged.
Right. Okay, but it could be almost what the negative, the pessimism or the kind of realism, know your limits. Know what kind of work you can actually succeed at.
So it seems obvious that if you could go on to read the Midrash, that the Midrash...
Wait, let's get there in a second.
Sorry.
Okay, good, yeah, good. Did you want to say the last thing about the pasuk?
I was just going to say that I think that Kohelet is balancing out other places that are more optimistic and telling us we are partners, to tell us that there are times we will not be able to figure out God's ways. Don't bother. Things will happen. Don't bother turning yourself into pretzels to try to figure it out. You won't.
Right.
There will be other things that will have clarity. Do them.
Right. Your comment, Malka, reminds me of a moment in class this week. This was a Jewish philosophy. One of the 11th graders was asking a very strong adolescent question, which was, everything in the Torah, in order for it to be true, has to be consistent. And I was trying, without sounding, old and patronizing, to say, actually, the older you get, the more multivocal, the more true, right? And so this pasuk can be true in its very, to the core of what it's trying to say, which doesn't negate the truth of being created in Tzelem Elokim. Modify or perhaps coexist.
Teenagers have to learn the extent of nuance.
Right. Okay, so let's jump into the Midrash, because you're right, things become, they're taken in a different direction. We're not reading the Midrash in order to understand the pasuk. We're reading the Midrash in order to understand how the rabbis are using this pasuk to say something.
Well, they're also responding anxiously to what is discomforting to them from the pasuk.
Yeah, and you're also right that they're responding to that open word, because it's not pinned down in the Hebrew, ivto. Okay, so let's look at it in the English. When God created Adam, he took him and led him round all the trees of the Garden of Eden, and said to him, "See my works, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. Now all that I have created, I created for your benefit." I just need to say the Hebrew, Bishvilech barati. Right? That should remind us of Rabbi Simcha Bunim. "Be careful that you do not ruin and destroy my world, for if you destroy it, there is no one to repair it after you. Ein mi sheyataken acharecha." So how does the Midrash take the pasuk? And by the way, I saw this, or a version of this, a phrase of it, when I went on a hike in Israel 2 summers ago. It was right outside the cave. This is quotable, right? And you could imagine why the environmental movement and why my student brought in her presentation, right? Taken certainly without any of the subtleties, is simply saying, don't screw this up. And there is a kind of delusion of infinite resource or infinite renewability that this pasuk, or this midrash rather, is putting an end to, right? There's no one to clean up your mess. This is it. It's all here, whatever you've got. What else does the midrash say to you? Yeah, Sima.
I'm just wondering, in light of this midrash, whether the he should be a lowercase he, because it's like, who can straighten out what man has made? In other words, what man has destroyed and made.
That's exactly right. The Midrash rereads the pasuk and shifts the burden or the responsibility of error from God onto man. That was Wendy's comment in the beginning. That's right. That the Midrash, the pasuk rather, leaves open both possibilities. The Midrash pins it down and says, actually, no, the responsibility for ruining it is solely on God. It's not on man. It's not that God has created anything that that needs fixing, we're the ones who possibly could come in and mess it up. What does tikkun mean here? What could it mean? It's a multimedia presentation. Any sounds?
Well, it's sort of using it in the way that these contemporary sci-fi movies use it, that, once you destroy the world, there is actually no possibility of fixing it, so you have to go
Somewhere
and
else.
find another asteroid. Or it's not as though it's not fixing this world. Like, once that world is fixed, avad hadavar.
Right.
Just sidebar, I
Please.
noticed, I was scanning, Genesis 1 actually doesn't include the word olam. It's
Doesn't
not-
include the word
word-
olam, no.
It doesn't include the word olam. So even that concept of the whole gestalt is not there
Mhm.
in the original plan.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, we were using olam from Genesis 1 as almost, right, that man as the climax of the creation becomes,
Or briat olam, and there's no,
Right.
it's not configured that way, at least on the linguistic level. There's no reference
Correct.
to the whole
Correct.
world
Correct.
in that story.
Correct. And the man becomes, the climax of and also the metonym for the world, and certainly in the way we were taking it with the Mishnah.
I don't know how it relates to the original pasuk, but could it mean the explanation, good and evil? God made good, enjoy it, but you who are tempted to do evil, you're going to dig your own grave, because I gave you, and this is an aside, I gave you free choice. I'm not going to come and fix the evil you've done. I've given you options, choose good. If you don't, and you destroy yourselves through bad actions, you're up a creek, because I'm not coming and fixing it.
I mean, what I think what you're opening up is in the Hebrew. Let's say when God says "Re'ei ma'asai kama na'im u'meshubachim hein." Look at my translation, my works. So the easy way and the environmental way of reading this is that it's about the natural world, but you're expanding it and saying, look at each other, look at each other,
This
and
is
look.
the whole world.
Beautiful.
There are all kinds of people. I've created everything. Take a look. There's all types here. If you are going to misuse it and destroy the entire beautiful world that I've made, it's up to you. I'm not coming in and
Right.
saving it.
Except that, as a psychologist, right, if you, quote unquote, mess up another person who's an olam, there is tikkun. And the tikkun actually comes from other people, right?
But
It's a
not
cycle.
God.
I'm God.
God is saying, you all have bechira.
Right.
If you choose afterwards to help each other,
Right,
great.
Right.
If you don't, and you're left with the evil,
right. But even if we don't have to go good and evil, but we say recognize that you all influence each other,
Each other.
right? So you're given all the raw material, right? It's your choices, but I'm not stepping in to actually fix it for you. Yeah, Jen.
The crooked, is that the literal definition?
Crooked, yeah.
And what's really meant by crooked? Because, crooked has a lot of different connotations. Is crooked inherently a negative attribute here?
It's interesting. There's another pasuk which is famous that gets quoted in the Gemara, right? Me'uvat, which is the same word as ivto. Me'uvat lo yuchal litkon, which the Gemara reads as, you can't ever. It's in the context of tefillah, but that pasuk is if you basically you don't show up for something, or is that for tefillah? I'm misremembering now.
I think it's
You
actually
miss-
also in Kohelet. I'd have to look.
V'chesron. There's a certain, I don't think it has to be inherently negative, but something which is, right, perhaps off or misshapen, right? It's hard for us to say that in a way that doesn't sound negative. It can't be, it is what it is.
I'm just gonna,
Yeah, go ahead.
if we're using the he with a capital H, then one could interpret it to say that, if you look at the Midrash, that, what God created is beautiful and praiseworthy. One could say then that, he made things crooked, but perhaps what's crooked is beautiful and praiseworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Like perhaps there's, it's not inherently negative.
Except for and the tein da'atcha shelo titkalel. Like, don't let anything go to ruin, right? If the kind of what you're suggesting would almost be learn how to see the beautiful in the crooked, right? Which I think is a beautiful message. I don't think it's here, but you could, the sense of you got to bring new glasses, you got to bring new lenses.
Right. But I mean, if you struggle with Kohelet
Yeah.
because it's by nature pessimistic, and you're uncomfortable with the fact that it's pessimistic, then you look for those messages.
100%. Okay, good. I'm just mindful of, I mean, this is wonderful. We could spend an hour on the source, but this was just the extra bonus. Okay, so go back into the packet. We're going to skip a little bit. We're going to go to the to source number 5. Okay, so all things being equal, from Kohelet, we brought us back to the notion that there is an inherent connection or set of connections between human beings and the natural world, or in Malka's more expanded sense, human beings, right, which are entrenched within the natural world and are part and parcel of the natural world. There's an interesting moment later on in Genesis, after Noach and his family comes off the Teva, when God says a very profound thing. And we're only going to talk about one piece of this profound thing. This is in source number 5, Genesis 8. Vayetze Noach uvanav v'ishto u'nshei vanav ito. Kol ha'chaya, kol ha'remes, v'chol ha'of. Everyone gets out of the teva. And in Pasuk Chaf, Noach builds a mizbeach, which is one of the first things he's done without being directed, on his own. And one could say a certain level, which maybe explains what happens the next verse, that Noach fundamentally misunderstands what God asked him to do, which was take care of all the creatures on this teva. He does that, but he comes off and he's able to sacrifice, right? Which seems a bit strange, having kept them alive and sustained them all this time. But in any event, he gives one of the behemot ha'tehorot, one of the pure animals. He offers it on the mizbeach. In Chaf Aleph, God smells the reach hanichoach, the pleasing odor, and he says to himself, Lo osif lekalel od et ha'adama ba'avur ha'adam. I will no longer allow the Adam to fully impact the Adama, such that the Adama can be undone because of human beings' actions. Okay, it doesn't mean that God will never punish man again. It doesn't mean that there won't be natural disasters again. It means that what happened before, what we saw set up in chapter 1, or what we just saw in Kohelet Rabbah of this fully interconnected realities of man and land, Adam, Adama, the same word, that is going to shift. I'm not going to allow that to happen again. So there is an acknowledgement, right, that even in the flow of Genesis, there was something too much about that interconnectedness, and things shift. Lots of things shift after the flood. Right now, going back to Genesis 1, now human beings are able to eat animals, which we can understand in lots of ways as a kind of concession, as a way of really teaching them the fundamental principles of Genesis 1 that we didn't get. If you eat animals, maybe you will recognize that you are human. You'll see your differentiation. You'll be able to see your responsibility in a different way. That's really another class. But something happens here. There's a separation, a radical separation between people and nature. All right. Now I want to jump back to what we spoke about last week when we talked about the presentation of human beings in chapter 1 and the Tselem Elokim. So I want to deepen 2 of those concepts. If you look at source number 6, there's a very famous Rashi, which is talking about day 2. We noticed last week that there are 2 times in Genesis 1 where one of the items that's created does not receive the valuation by God that it is tov, right? And we entertain possibilities. What does it mean? It's bad? Right? Is this God doesn't look at it in the same way as God looks at the others? How do we make sense of it? The first time where it doesn't say Tov is in day 2 when God creates the Rakia. Anyone remember what the Rakia is?
It's the heavens.
It's the heavens, but in the logic of the Pasuk, the Rakia is the divider. Okay, and I find myself explaining this every year and having no idea what this means or what it correlates to in the actual universe, but it's a divider between the upper waters and the lower waters. It's translated often, or it's called in Genesis 1, the Shamayim, the actual sky. We now understand the sky is not, some kind of real canopy, but it's a divider between what was all water. Now there's a separation. That's the Rakia. That's the whole thing that gets created on day 2. And it doesn't say Kitov. Rashi asks, Ala rakia, me'ala rakia lo ne'amar, ela me'ala rakia, lefi shehen tluyin ba'avir. That's not actually what I wanted to read. Umipnei ma, why doesn't it? Lo ne'amar ki tov bayom sheni, lefi shelo haya nigmar melechet hamayim ad yom hashlishi, v'harei hitchil ba basheni, v'davar shelo nigmar eino bimlo'o v'tuvo. ובשלישי שנגמרה מלאכת המים והתחיל וגמר מלאכה אחרת, כפל בו כי טוב שני פעמים. אחת לגמר מלאכת השני ואחת לגמר מלאכת היום. Says Rashi something which we didn't actually understand when we saw the word tov. Tov does not mean good. Tov means complete. Now, although the rakia itself was made on day 2, the rakia was really part of a larger effort, which was all of the malacha of the mayim, of the water. Day 2 was rakia. Day 3 is when the rakia was, the water rather was convened into, right, oceans and large bodies of water, and then there was the dry land. So the business of the water, as we might say, begins in day 2 and doesn't end until the middle of day 3. When that happens in the middle of day 3, then there is a word tov. Sounds like a very technical Rashi, but he's actually explaining, right, this oddity which we couldn't figure out in terms of the rakia. Now, if that's true in terms of day 2, what happens if we apply that to human beings? And we've already said this outside, but now let's see it in the source. If tov means complete, the fact that it doesn't say tov in relationship to human beings in chapter 1 violates the pattern of everything else, makes a lot of sense. In what way is man not complete at the end of chapter 1? Take a look at source number 7. We have 2 options really for this idea. Today we'll read Rabbi Chanuch Waxman, who was a teacher of mine at Trisha many years ago, and he writes for the virtual Beit Midrash of Yeshivat Har Etzion. All of this is meant to force upon us the following conclusion. If mankind stands in parallel to the world, if the creation process of mankind parallels and resembles that of the world, then just as the world is created in an initial state, so too mankind is created in an initial state. If the world begins its way possessed by the void, empty, dark, and deep, so too mankind begins its way possessing void, emptiness, darkness, and depths. If the positive element in the world at the beginning of its making is the wind, spirit, or presence of Elohim, then so too the positive in mankind at its beginnings is its Tselem Elohim. Just as Elohim of chapter 1 counters the darkness and chaos and forms a well-ordered and good world, so too must Tselem Elohim counter his own internal dark chaos and form a well-ordered and good world. In fact, the text of Parshat Adam utilizes both the verb bara and the noun tselem 3 times, implicitly balancing them off one against the other and placing them in tension. The entire parallel implicitly provides another challenge to mankind, another mission, the task of self-making. Hence, we have stumbled upon another sense in which man is not yet complete, not yet good. Mankind has yet to imitate the labor of Elohim, not just in the external realm of the world, but also in the internal realm of man's self. You see my influences, okay? Very clear. If we now apply this sense of tov to human beings, we see, as we said, that the fundamental quality of being a human being in chapter 1 is this Tselem Elohim, which we define in lots of possible ways. Most fundamentally, says Rabbi Waxman, being created in Tselem Elohim means imitatio Deo, right? Behaving like God, emulating God, imitating God. The God of chapter 1 is the God who creates chaos, creates order out of chaos. We have to do that too. And that is not a simple process. It's not a simple process for any human being. It's not a simple process for the collective humanity. That's ongoing. So we are not Tov. We're not yet Tov. It's an indeterminate kind of evaluation because it requires constant self-fashioning and constant work. This is that balance that we spoke about, right? And with Rabbi Simcha Bunim, we could now say is like the challenge of being a human being. How do you do that in an effective way? How do you do that in a way that will help you achieve your godlike qualities without resorting back to chaos? Okay. Now we're really moving. If you look, just so you know what you have, in source 8, Leon Cass, whom we read a lot in this school in 12th grade, who wrote a phenomenal book on the book of Breshit, the beginning of wisdom, he says something very similar to what we just read with Waxman, slightly different formulation. If you want to read it afterwards, I encourage. He comes back to that notion of tselem, which we said last week, is a likeness. It resembles, it represents, but it's not the thing itself. We are not God, and yet we are told that we are so much like God. And part of what we're going to see in the next few classes is that human beings have a hard time figuring out where the self ends and God begins. If I am a representation of God or an extension of God, and I have the capacity to act like God in the world and be like God, where do I set the limits? How do I know when I've overstepped, both in my own olam, my own tselem elokim, and in terms of the collective effort? All right. This is what I would like to do now. Actually, are there no comments yet? Okay. So if you look now at Roman numeral 3, entitled The Singularity of Being Human, Opportunities and Threats. We've talked about tikkun, we've talked about stability and the self and the world. It's time to look at chapter 2 and see what comes up in the second account of the creation of mankind. Let's do 5 minutes of chavruta, all right? If you're online, I guess you're on your own. If you look at source number 12, this is Genesis chapter 2, Parak Bet. And you notice right away that the beginning of Parak Bet is the psukim about Shabbat, which you don't expect to find there, but there they are. And in Pasuk Dalid is where the telling of the creation of the world begins again with a completely different set of concerns and foci. We spent a lot of time with our students learning the different strategies for managing these double tellings and what emerges and doesn't emerge from the tellings. For now, let's narrow in on the psukim themselves. From Pasuk Daled all the way until Chaf Hei, there is a what we call a ma'amar musgar, a set of psukim in the middle that are just about the Garden of Eden, which will tell you very little about humanity. You can skim those psukim, okay, and come back, pick up with the narrative of, again, ask the same questions. What did we learn about the nature of man from chapter 2? What did we learn about the relationship between people? And what do we learn about the relationship between God and man? Okay, real or aspirational, whatever you find in the psukim. All right, so this is the chavruta time. I'll learn with you.
Okay. So you want us to read it?
Yeah, so let's read through. Let's read through the psukim, English, Hebrew. Go ahead.
So malacha is a word. Vayishpot b'yom hashvi'i mikol malachto asher asa. Vayivarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i vayikadesh oto. 2 words. Ki vo shavat mikol malachto asher bara Elohim la'asot.
So this is all really belongs in chapter 1, right?
And it's repetitive in ways that suggest almost poetry and
Correct.
Okay.
Let's start with Bia Pasukah.
Ele toldot hashamayim ba'aretz b'hi bar'am b'yom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim v'chol siach hasadeh terem yeh ba'aretz v'chol esef hazadeh terem yitzmach ki lo himtir Adonai Elohim al haaretz v'adam ayin lavod et adama. So the order, as we know, is totally not the same.
Right. It's amazing. I love that V'adam ayin lavod et hadama. It's like, of course, it already knows of what's coming next. Even much in the same way, Breshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'haaretz is not being told in some kind, but that the presence, the absence of man, right, is worth talking about. It's like the Tohu Vavohu also.
It's also interesting that it's Ele Toldot. I mean, it's like now we have the first Toldot narrative when they are created in that passive language, as if though they have their own story.
Right, independent of God, whereas Breshit bara Elokim.
Yeah, and here
very God focused.
Weird Nifa.
You know, I had this, I got a version of this class being videoed, and they only had the English because they were non-Hebrew readers, and I asked them what they noticed, and the God beginning at the beginning, right, which you don't see in Hebrew. As a Hebrew reader, you notice the Vayomer, at the start of each day. You know, but that was really right. That is the focus, right? The God-centeredness of chapter 1. All right.
But it does say that God, was waiting to.
Ve'edia lemina aretz, mishka et kol adama. So it seems as though the first part of the stage of creation is our primeval rain, or vapor rain. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et Adam afar mina adama. So we've got a new verb. It's vayitzer.
And then
Vayipach ba'avav nishmat chaim.
To live and to tend it.
And Adama, you start to realize, didn't really play a role at all in chapter 1. Right? There's Ha'adam, but
so
there's
now
no,
you're right. Yeah. So now the pun is becoming evident.
right.
Um,
He Ha'adam l'nefesh chaya. I never think about what you just said about Behi Baram. There's also a kind of reflexive sense of that, as opposed to, even though there's the Vayitzer, Vayipach, but at the end, it's not about, it's not as God focused. God did this.
well, it's not saying ye.
Right, right.
Not
right.
the-
Well, there's no speech at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Vayita Adonai Elohim gan be'eden mikedem, vayasem sham et ha'adam asher yatzar.
Right.
So kedem is interesting because it's east, but also primeval.
And I just love that Vayasim Sham Asher Yatzar, like lest you forget that there's so much love in that verb. You know, it's not just this man that came to be, but he made him, he placed him, and he planted it for him.
ויצמח אדוני אלוהים מן האדמה כל עץ נחמד למראה וטוב למאכל ואת החיים בתוך הגן ואת הדעת טוב ורע. I was noticing apropos of this, like that this is kind of an interesting intertextual midrash on the end of well, not the very end, but on Genesis 1, because there it is Vayar Elohim et Asher Asa.
The Re'eh, yeah, that's nice. That's nice.
But here it's not. There's no evaluative language like that.
Right.
It's a plan, but there's no evaluative language. And Tov obviously is meaning something else here. If Tov is complete there, it's not.
Right.
If Ra
Correct.
is the antithesis.
Correct. Which actually bothers the students a great deal after we spend a lot of time talking about how Tov works. It's just chapter 2. Why are you using a new sense of it? Stick with it, right? But it does mean something totally different in Perek Bet. And in Perek Gimel.
Proof that they're two totally different stories. And one is about design and categories, and this is about maybe morality. Okay, so you want to skip the cool geography?
Skip from Yud through Yud to Dalet.
You Dalet is Chidekel.
I'm sorry, through Yud Dalet.
What's so interesting is my nephew lives in Nachlaot, and all the streets there are called like Chidekel and Prat and.
You get bang for your buck as you work through reading these. It's so cute.
ויקח אדוני אלוהים את האדם והניחהו בגן עדן לעובדה ולשמרה.
It's enough like Yanichehu as opposed to Vayasem, but the same sense. And now Lo'avda L'Shamra.
You almost have the
Which is-
feeling that
Every society.
Ha'adam is a baby, needs to be
It's not.
Well, there's
put in a little
It's like,
basket.
some kind of,
power.
except
The
that he has to start
gentleness.
working. Yeah.
Right, but could you see this as almost like a maternal image? Right? Except that, put him to work. Lo'avda or L'Shamra, but of it. Right, when we're talking about again the kind of like the man in nature, the man in the natural law. In chapter 1, man comes at the end of it and is sort of the master of, but embedded within. Here, it's really embedded with it, or created outside or of it, and then
Well, so there's a whole circle placed. The whole world is a nice big basket. Has to be lifted over.
right.
There is a midrash.
ויצב אדוני אלוהים על האדם לאמור בכל עת הגן אכול תאכל ומעת הדעת טוב ורע לא תאכל ממנו. Because טוב ורע, it's not an incomplete tree. כי ביום אכולך ממנו מות תמות. There's this awesome story by this contemporary Israeli writer Leah Shoham on this, like told from the point of view of the Nachash, who's really pissed that he gets such a bad rap, if it's a he, because this is a law. nothing happens to them.
Right, right.
And God is a
right.
liar, and Nachash calls God out as a liar, and therefore that's why God gets so angry, and
Wow.
Nachash is the only one
Can
that
you
gets
send that to me?
For sure.
Throw that into my arsenal. Of
Yeah, yeah,
Persian meat,
absolutely.
unforgettable.
Absolutely.
Is a connector.
The whole book is amazing. It's called Chaverim
Well,
Shalom.
that phrase,
What is
a
that?
lot of connected.
But I will definitely send you the story. And hilarious. ומעץ הדעת אמרה לא תאכל ממנו, okay, ויאמר אדוני אלוהים לא טוב היות אדם לבדו. Here's another idea of לא טוב.
Yeah, but it's
And then we're gonna talk about more.
But it's also the sense of completion.
Something's not right. Eselo ezer connecto. Now there, it's actually not so hard. There the students I find are happy to bring back that notion of tov.
Because it's an
Right.
incompletion.
Right, so you need someone else in order to achieve completion. You can make that one work, but you can't make it work for the others.
And then that vagina was separated.
So then how you reconcile that and
Right, you
later?
can't.
Male and female.
Could Peru and revoke.
Okay. And
Unless you could
and-
vitov l'machal, you could actually work because it's a sense of it's reached its completion, it's ready for eating. Tovara, but that's altogether
Yeah,
a
tov
different
vara.
kind of phrase.
Yes. Unless we have to redefine what ra is.
Interesting, okay, let's just.
וייצר אדוני מן האדמה כל חיית בשדה ואת כל עוף השמיים והבא אל האדם לראות מה יקרה לו. Here, the Adam gets to be the seer,
Right.
the apprehender.
Right.
וכל אשר יקרא לו האדם.
Well, actually, no. Lirot ma yikralo. That's
That
like
God will
God
see.
will see what man will. But of course, they're seeing as part of the process of naming.
It's hard to know with that infinitive. וירא אל האדם כדי שאלוהים יראה. כדי לראות, from the point of view of God,
Right.
or is it האדם לראות,
Lirot.
so that he should see
Kedeli kroto.
what he
Interesting.
should see.
Yeah, you're right.
בכל מה...
But he didn't form it from the dust of the earth, he formed it from his, woman, man. For woman.
אחרי כל אשר יקרא לו האדם, נפש חיה הוא שמו. Now that's interesting because the nefesh chaya is the same way that Adam had been referred. Vayi Adam le nefesh chaya. So now, as like nefesh chaya gets to call the other. Vayikra Adam shemot l'chol habehema u'l'chol of hashamayim u'le'of hashamayim u'l'chol chayat hasadeh u'l'adam lo matza ezer kenegdo. So here, Adam has to be a participant in realizing that he needs this.
Right.
It would be.
It does. But interestingly, ule Adam lo matzah. Does it? It's still not fully Adam as the one who doesn't find. Right. It's being told about him.
Right? So again, is that God seeing that or is that Adam? Vayapel Adonai Elohim tarzema al Adam vayishan vayikach echad
No. We're going to
mitzalot.
stop at 2 minutes. We're going to stop at 2 minutes.
Crazy. They were all sitting there and talking, so we're out, you know? So.
Oh no, we were supposed to be talking together in
Oh,
pairs.
really? Oh.
That's what she was
Sorry, that wasn't
intending.
clear. No, everybody's reading the source and talking about
No,
it.
it's like they're working together in
Yeah,
mutual
everybody's reading
and
about
we feel
themselves.
completely
I'm
out.
Oh, sorry, but the idea is that you would work together.
No,
We're familiar with the story.
All right. We're going to come back together in 1 minute.
You know, I've been around shul long enough that every time you read Bereshit, it's been 60 times already. Because I studied it.
All right.
bring it back
Let's come back together. We only have about 15 more minutes. I know we still have much more to say about this parak. I'm sorry about that. Okay. All right, so let's see if we can be targeted in our responses, and everybody will look back at the psukim. So there's lots to say. There's lots to say, especially after having done the reading of Parak Aleph last week in contrast. But if we can pull out, what do we learn in Parak Bet, or how does Parak Bet present the nature of humanity, who human beings are or ought to be? Number 2, the implied relationship between God and humanity. And then the third is the relationship between people or among humanity. Why don't we start with relationship between God and humanity? What do you see in Parak Bet? I'll start with an insight and maybe that will get some juices going. One thing that we noticed in our learning is that there are all these phrases that seem to imply a lot of protection and care. The placing, the careful placing, right? God crafts human beings out of the dust and then blows the breath of life into human beings, right? Which we'll come back to in a minute. But then afterwards, God plants a garden for Adam. God almost, it sounds like lifting, Wendy was saying it sounded almost maternal, like carrying and then putting the baby into the basket. That's what it seems like in chapter 2. Like God has really thought about and is caring for this human, and then gives a task to human beings, which is so different than what we read in chapter 1. L'ovda'u l'shomra, it's in relationship now specifically to the natural world, as in this microcosm of Gan Eden. There doesn't seem to be anything implied in that mission of L'ovda'u l'shomra, which has to relate back to God. It's not like the Tzelem Elohim, keep creating, keep doing, keep creating order. It's really just kind of tending to, right? Cultivating, making sure that this place, maybe going back to Kohelet Rabbah, that this place stays as beautiful as it is right now. Right? I think of it like gardening. It's not hard work that human beings are tasked with giving, but it's all enclosed in this well-designed, beautiful world that human beings are placed into. Yeah, go ahead.
The first creation is about a general world, the whole world, where man just happens to be a piece of it. And the second creation story is like literally designed for man. So it's like a bifurcation in the world. Its world is for everything, but it's also for man. So this is like a view.
It's a totally right. You're totally right that was everything, and this is only human beings.
Only human beings.
But just to push you a little bit, what we were saying last week is that even though chapter 1 is about the whole world, the focus, the chapter itself, by having all those all those verses about humanity, and the deviation from the structure is calling your attention to say human beings are the climax of this too. So the focal point, you're 100% right, is totally different. And in chapter 2, when you read it again each time, it's like there's that word Adam, Adama, and is front and center. Everything else is not even talked about. It's not the story that's being told.
The animals are made for
but even within that,
to name, etc., etc. It's a human, homocentric.
Right. So I'm asking you, what is the relationship that this chapter seems to present between God and man? Yes, man's the focus, but what is he? What is God asking of him? What should he do in terms of his relationship with God? Where's the growth? Where's the challenge? Where's the aspiration? We saw in Parak Aleph what was clear. He had to act like God. Chapter 2? I'm not sure.
He has to work the fields.
Really
so what does that have to do with God, right?
To refrain from eating the tree of knowledge. And that's what it sounds like.
Okay, but that's because you know about chapter 3, right? You're right that that is his sivui,
That's
right?
what it says. You're here to stay in Gan Eden, enjoy it, but the only thing I'm telling you is don't eat from the tree.
Right. Now, I was joking with you, right? Of course, we know that sivui, which shows up here, is really important because of what plays out later. But if you didn't have chapter 3, right, is this the sum total? This is what human beings need to do, is to keep this one mitzvah? Is that why they're here, to refrain? Right? Or is that seem to be a really important component of living in Gan Eden, which is mysterious? It's mysterious, right?
It is,
that's
or wouldn't
choice.
be mentioned. It's the whole basis of choice. Are you going to choose good or are you going to choose bad? But right now, we're not dealing with that, but it's going to be an issue for you people.
Okay, so then there's a different kind of conflict than we saw in chapter 1.
In chapter 1, there were no prohibitions at all.
Right.
Like there was nothing that you...
Right.
Nothing.
There were just certain really big responsibilities that seemed to interfere with other ones, or possibly, needed.
But everything in the affirmative. It's
Right.
not even imagining any kind of negative. The worst that you have is not saying tov.
Right. Correct. In the absence. Right. And Wendy noticed again in our learning, not only is there, tovara here, but then later when God says, and this is in verse 18, which is really important, Pasuk Yud Chet, after all that we just mentioned, in Pasuk Yud Chet, God says, I'll read in the English, it's underlined, the Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. Right? Lo tov. So there's Ra and then there's Lo tov. Now what does that mean? When God says about man, not to man, okay? So it's not a vayavarech, it's not a speaking towards, it's not a blessing. He says about him, it's not good that he's alone. Selo ezer kenegdo. That's a very loaded question that I'm asking you. But what does it mean to suggest that it's not good? I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll tell you what many of the students say, and gender, which we haven't fully explored in this class, but it's front and center when we talk about this in 12th grade. Many of them say, well, it's not good because it's not good for a man to be by himself. It's not good for any person to be by themselves. People need to have company. They need to have, right? Parak Aleph, it was right there. Parak Bet, again, not dealing with the problems that these two different stories present, there's something not good for his neshama. There's something not good for his emotional life. He needs to have partnership.
And it follows the tree of knowledge with, you might need some help
Interesting.
knowing what's good and what's bad. There's that little
Interesting. That's
there.
very nice, right? That right after God says, gives him that sivui. Now, of course, knowing chapter 3, that's very, right? That's very interesting.
Here
Good.
about when it comes to good and evil, which you don't know about yet, but I'm telling you, red star, red flag. By the way, you'll need a helper.
Right.
That helper is going to either be for you or against
Good.
you in that
Good.
pursuit.
Yeah, good.
So I'm wondering, I'm always wondering what this all tells us about the relation of gender and Tselem Elohimness, because God doesn't need a partner. I mean, unless we're reading those times when God speaks in the plural, like Nasa Adam B'Tzelmin. So is that what actually, that companyness?
Okay, good. Can you hold that thought? Because we're getting right there in a minute, okay? Because that's where Rashi takes us in a certain sense. But there's the emotional reading, okay? And there's an awareness where Malka was taking us of somehow being in relationship with God, which in chapter 2 seems to have at least the component of Lovda Ola Shamra and keep this mitzvah. Now, the ethical is mixed up with all that, okay? It seems to be a postscript, but you're right, it's directly following on it. So somehow the presentation of this other, or the need for this other, is connected in some way to what God expects of mankind. Either, as you said,
But I don't know
it
if
will.
there's a moral piece to it yet, because it just says, I'm going to be putting in a tree of knowledge of good and bad, but you have no idea what that is. Don't eat it. It doesn't speak to.
Not for him, but for us as readers, right? Right, not for him. He's not told really any of this. This is not a
There's no
conversation
moral
he's privy to.
introduction.
Correct. Okay? Now, skipping to the Rashi, what Wendy just mentioned, okay? The way that, and there's lots to say about Parak Bet, where we're going to focus on this lo tov. And Rashi says, what does it mean lo tov? Why is it not good? He doesn't offer the emotional read. What is not good? Lest they say there are two dominions. The Holy One, blessed be He, is alone among the heavenly beings, and He has no mate. And this one, man, among the earthly creatures, has no mate. Okay, now you have to use a bit of imagination to understand this. Rashi, if taken literally, right, he's quoted in the Midrash, makes no sense. If there only was one, there would never be others who would say this. Okay, so what Rashi's really saying is, what's not good about man is it's not good for man to see oneself as so close to God. Why would we see ourselves as so close to God? Well, at this frozen moment in time, there was a one and there was a one. Okay, so for human beings to see themselves fully as a one, as a levad, as an echad really, that's too dangerous theologically because there's only one, and that's the God one. So the introduction of the other, in this sense, the other gender, right, and we could really explore that further, or simply the ethical other, human beings need to know that they are a one that's really two. Not just because it's good for them practically, that's chapter 1, not just because it's good for them because they will then be able to perpetuate this series. This is not at all about logistics. This is about sense of self. And this anxiety over people seeing themselves as too much like God, which is how we've been framing all of these sources, Rashi is consistent and picks up on it throughout our chapters. Since you mentioned Parak Gimel, Malka, it's right here. If you look at the source number 14, where Rashi talks about at the end of chapter 3, okay, which is a really complicated chapter. At the end of chapter 3, after both Ish and Isha, both Adam and Chava, have eaten from the tree, and they now have a new sense of who they are, God says at the end that now human beings have become echad mimenu, haya ke'echad mimenu, one like us. Who's the us? There's that plural problem. More importantly, what flows from that, I don't have the psukim there, but what flows from that statement, this is in Pasuk Chavbet, verse 22, man has become one like us to know good and evil. And now he might extend his hand and eat from that other tree, about which there were no restrictions, that being the Eitz HaChaim, and if he eats from that tree, he will live forever. So the eviction from Gan Eden comes after that statement, right? We often think that part of their punishment was the eviction. The eviction wasn't the punishment, it was the consequence, right? After they had eaten from this tree, and again, we have to explain that much better, but after they've eaten from the tree, now there was a concern that they would eat from the other tree, and so they are removed. Rashi says about this pasuk, Haya ke'echad mimenu. He has become like one of us. What does that mean? He, meaning it's capital H, but it's man, is unique among the earthly beings, just as I am unique among the heavenly beings. And what is his uniqueness? To know good and evil, unlike the cattle and the beasts, right? So the differentiation, the moral reasoning, or the capacity to make moral choices is what distinguishes us from the animals, but it doesn't distinguish us from God. So there's a new concern after Perek Gimel that we again will see ourselves as too much. Look at the end of Rashi. V'ata pen yishlach yado, and now lest he stretched forth his hand, and if he were to live forever, he would be likely to mislead people, again, fictional people, to follow him and to say that he too is a deity. Says Rashi, right? The concern, the ongoing concern throughout our chapters is this constant balance and the difficulty that human beings have in achieving and understanding, again, those two notes in the pockets, or an understanding of when they end and God begins. This project of emulation of God, this project of self-awareness or knowing self, which, as we said, directly relates to knowing God, does not have strict boundaries that human beings are able to fall or grow into easily. What we're going to see over the next two classes are really two case studies, two moments in the Prakim. One is the very next chapter, chapter 4, the story of Cain and Hevel, the first murder, and the last class is the story of the Tower of Babel. They are both stories where we see human beings trying to work out, as we said, the vertical and the horizontal, the balance between self-realization and emulating God without overstepping the lines.
But God didn't want apparently for us to have that knowledge, because he said don't eat from the tree of knowledge. So it sounds odd. Did he want us to be like just the animals? So what did he create us for if there wasn't a moral component that separated us?
I think you did this last class too. You asked a really big, layered question just as we were out of time. And we are not going to fully explore Perek Gimel, right? Because it doesn't neatly illustrate this particular predicament that I want to explore. But yes, the realization at the end that this thing that it seems like God doesn't want, if you read the story literally, but if you read it with other strategies, which we teach our students how to do, you don't find that actually this is what God didn't want them to do. This is a description perhaps of the accumulation of reason or the ability to then grow into this role. The problem is there are responsibilities that come with that. And Rashi is, I think, giving expression to the anxiety over that responsibility. Okay?
Is it possible to ask something?
All right. Thank you.